department at the University of Wyoming. And in sort of a mix of regards, I have had the honor of being in some of Dr. Patton's classes, and I can personally attest to just how inspirational and insightful and just a joyous person to have as a professor, and most definitely I can assume in a fireside chat. So I'm super excited for being with you and here tonight, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much. This is fantastic. I'm really excited. I think this is a great opportunity to just dive into some really important people and history, and have a good conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so tonight our fireside chat is revolving around the Honorable Miss Harriet Elizabeth Byrd. And I will just go into some background for those of you who might not be so familiar with Mrs. Byrd, and then we'll just jump right in. And as you all may know, I will use Liz Byrd or Mrs. Byrd just as like that's what you Google and her name as, so I don't want to get any confusion. But Liz Byrd was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming on April 20th of 1926. She was born in Wyoming as a fourth generation Wyomingite after her grandfather moved to Wyoming in 1876 as a railroad worker after the Civil War ended. Mrs. Byrd went to school in Cheyenne and attempted to get a bachelor's degree from the University of Wyoming, but they were not allowing at that time Black students to join in their congregation. So she ended up going to an HBCU, or informally known as an HBCU in West Virginia, at West Virginia State, where she ended up graduating with her bachelor's in education in 1949. And then she decided to come back to her family, move back to Wyoming, where she tried to get a job within the Laramie County School District. During this time, obviously still segregation and integration not necessarily in full force, segregation still in full force. So the Laramie County School District at the time she applied actually didn't allow for Black people to be employed by them. So seeing that, she ended up getting a job at the Air Force Base in Cheyenne. It was then named Fort Warren Base, where she taught while getting her master's degree from the University of Wyoming. By that time, the university had allowed Black students to come in, so she ended up completing her master's in education in 1976. And thankfully, in 1959, so sort of in the interim of that period, Laramie County School District decided to allow Mrs. Byrd to become a teacher there, where she became the first fully certified African-American teacher in the entire state of Wyoming. So a trailblazer on all accounts, and really an inspirational educator. Not only did she break boundaries and borders in her teaching career and getting an education, but through her time as an educator, she was just decorated with an enormous amount of awards and honorariums for her dedication to volunteering and education. But beyond that, after her 37 years of teaching, Mrs. Byrd decided that she could make a bigger impact on the community. So she ran for Wyoming House in 1981 and won her seat and kept it until 1988, serving as the first African-American woman in the Wyoming House of Representatives. And if that wasn't enough of boundary breaking, Ms. Byrd was not done running and representing the great state of Wyoming. And so she ended up running and winning a state Senate seat from 1989 to 1892. 1992. And again, she was the first African-American woman to serve in both capacities. So during her time as an educator, a volunteer, a legislator, Mrs. Byrd was awarded with a numerous amount, as I said before, of honorariums and awards. And I just want to sort of give a span of the impact she made on this community. I'll go over some of the awards that she was granted through her life, and it's a longer list than I could put into this short Zoom call, but just to give you an idea, from the Laramie County School District, she got an advisory board service recognition for her service work during her undergrad. She was awarded a certificate from the City Council of Columbus, Ohio, and the California State Governor's Office for dedication to community service work. She had a certificate of appreciation from the city of Cheyenne, from the city of Cheyenne, a certificate of special recognition by Maxine Waters while she was serving in Congress in California. She has a certificate of appreciation by the National Latin American Federation, Boy Scouts of America, Veterans of Foreign Wars. She was an honorary policewoman in the city of Cheyenne, an honorary citizenship award for the city of Columbus. And my personal favorite that I think I had no idea about, she was featured in the May 1984 and the March 1987 edition of Ebony magazine. And just a side sub, Dr. Patton, have you ever seen those magazines? Have you seen her features in those?
I have seen her in that, and she's also in the I Dream a World book. And I don't know if you've seen the I Dream a World, but it's all of the who's who of Black women and their impact on the United States and beyond.
Yep. I read about that one too. And so, yeah, just an incredibly decorated and accredited woman that has truly made a huge impact on Wyoming politics and education, but is unfortunately oftentimes left out of these mainstream narratives in education that we have in Wyoming. So without further ado, I'd like to get this fireside chat started. And Dr. Patton is absolutely one of the best people to have in this chat, seeing all the work that she's done within the university to honor Mrs. Byrd's legacy, but also having, a personal connection with her. And so we'll get into that a little later. But Dr. Patton, I want to sort of dig into the work you do, and especially tying it into our series within the Black Studies Center, the oral history series, and the importance and significance of oral histories, especially with your communication and journalism background. So can you sort of describe how oral histories have shaped your work and your research?
Yeah, absolutely. But before I do, I just want to get it out now, and we can always go back to it later. But I just want to say, with regard to Mrs. Byrd, that my husband and I, we started a fund. It's the Harriet Elizabeth Liz Byrd Excellence Fund. It's been established for quite some time, but I'd love to talk about that because it was just incredible to spend time with her and her family in the creation of such an award. And there's 3 areas that are covered. So if you happen to be a student who is also an AADS minor or major, then there is money there and available for you in terms of study abroad when that comes back after COVID-19. There are opportunities for scholars and residents, and then there's also guest speakers. So I just have to give a plug for this Excellence Fund that I co-created.
No, and rightfully so. And I have a huge section I have on my notes, just feel like I wanted to finish it out because I figured that's where we would sort of just go on about relatable things that people in Wyoming want to hear about, maybe more so, and students specifically. But yeah, we'll get to it. Don't worry. I want you to be able to share everything about that experience, especially your communications and conversations with her. So yeah, we can start there also if you would prefer, like totally up to you.
Hey, you're running the show. You're the moderator. I'm just ready to answer some questions.
I know. You found my weakness, offering to mix up my progress.
Yes.
No. Okay, well, let's jump in, and then we'll get to it. We'll get to it for sure. But what I do, and I also want to offer people sort of a background on you more, and so they can sort of see the work and research that you do and why maybe we chose to invite you to this. So yeah, so how have oral history sort of impacted or influenced the research you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in everything that I do, oral history is involved because I'm a communication professor. And at the heart of communication is the art of dialogue, the art of speaking with one another, the art of having a vigorous debate. And so for me, I've spent my entire career centering the voices and experiences of marginalized, disenfranchised, and erased peoples. And at the heart of everything that I've done in terms of my research and my scholarship has been about moving those voices from the margin, from erasure, bringing them into visibility to see what we can learn from them and how what they say can and cannot alter history and how we understand one another. As a communication professor, communication is everything. It's the art of speaking well. And so with the art of speaking well, that's how we come to know one another. We're also a storytelling people. And so oral histories are so important. And I love oral histories because it allows for that space to be created, that liminal space, if you will, but that space to be created that pushes and moves the sanctioned histories that we often learn and can regurgitate from kindergarten forward. And so with oral histories, it's a nice counter to expanding and giving breadth and depth to people who might not be centered, whose stories might be inconvenient in, I'm using quotation marks here, in the retelling of major historical events. And so as a communication scholar, I specialize in critical cultural communication. I specialize in critical media studies. And so what that means is I've spent my career and many of the classes I teach centering the isms, beyond that black, white, binary, and division, but really delving in to see what is happening at both a local, a national, and an international level. And so when I think about oral histories, we have to be able to, if the person is still alive, why not take the opportunity to have those conversations? There's conversation and richness in just the everyday aspects of life, not just what's bound within the textbook. And so that's why I love the field of communication so much, as well as coupling that with oral history, because it just allows for there to be a new way of meaning making and a new way of understanding between people who might be different from us, and then how communication can either impact, hinder, advance that understanding between people who might be different for whatever reason from us.
Right. Right. And you talk about communication, and then maybe we'll just jump right in. You got the honor to speak with Mrs. Byrd and when creating this Excellence Fund, correct?
I did.
Can you sort of speak? I mean, what impact did she leave on you? What did you teach? What did she teach you, if anything? And what was she like?
Oh my gosh. Well, Mrs. Byrd was an amazing person. You've hit all of the highlights, and I want to, go back here in a little bit and kind of tease out some of that introduction of what you said in terms of why it's relevant in an oral history. But Mrs. Byrd, so really, at the time, I was a faculty member in African American Diaspora Studies. There was a different chair at the time whenever we first made introductions with Mrs. Byrd. And we were both surprised. And the former chair is Dr. Gracie Lawson Borders, who has been at Howard University for, oh gosh, probably a decade or more at this time. But one of the things that made it interesting was we didn't know that she existed, not because of the great works that she has done, but because no one was really talking about all of the great works that she had done. And we accidentally stumbled upon her in the I Dream a World book and a couple of other things. And so we drove over there and we set up a meeting that we thought would be a half an hour. And any of you who know, speaking at the font of elders, sometimes it's not going to be half an hour. And I'm so glad that she made space in her day for us, because we left 4 hours later. And from there, our relationship grew. We were, because by then I had become the department head for African American Diaspora Studies. And it was nice speaking to her, getting to know her family. I mean, one of the things that sticks out is, and that's missing from most history books, is when you close your eyes and you think about who is in Wyoming, we rarely ever think Black women. And she was one of those examples. And in my time being in Wyoming, I often have students say, well, I'm a 5th generation Wyomingite, or I'm a 4th generation Wyomingite. Well, very few people, regardless of ethnic background, can say that she was a 4th generation, her children were 5th generation, her grandchildren are 6th generation Wyomingites. And that's really important for the telling and retelling of how we think about the state of Wyoming and the impact that people of color, BIPOC people, make in this state, who are often erased in favor of one easy to tell, simple recounting. And there's many more layers that are there. And so with Mrs. Byrd, the first time we met subsequently for years after that, until we were able to establish this excellence fund. And then sadly, she has since passed away. But every time I spoke to her, I learned something new, and I learned some nuances about some of the stories that we may think we know, but missing some of the intricacies and backgrounds of things that we don't know.
Right, right. Can you sort of speak to some of those? I mean, doing research for this, you can go online, go through the archives, and zoom in on these like poorly written old articles, and you can go through it and you can sort of get an idea, but you don't get the full scope, right? And I don't even know if you would be able to get the full scope if Mrs. Byrd's legacy was maybe more thoroughly inundated in like our education system. So can you sort of speak to those nuances and intricacies that you got a firsthand sight at?
Sure. So number one, she expanded my idea of who was in Wyoming. Black people were in Wyoming. Chinese and Chinese Americans were in Wyoming. Obviously, we are on native soil, and so that was all very important and very much recognized by Mrs. Byrd. But just even, I'll kind of answer your question going backward in time a little bit. Like when we think about her father who was here, we think about the fact that he was here so early. He witnessed Wyoming coming into statehood. There are not that many stories captured of people who recorded who are also Black saying, I witnessed Wyoming coming into statehood. We often think only about Buffalo Soldiers and the railroads, but we're not thinking about newly manumitted enslaved peoples who sought freedom and fortune and just the ability to breathe and live coming west. And so those people are erased from our history. When I think about Mrs. Byrd, and this goes back to us creating this endowed fellowship, her excellence fund. And I was really surprised that no one had done that before, because I would have thought, surely someone who has made such an impact on the state, who has long history in this state, would have had something named after her from the University of Wyoming. Until, for example, you noted that in 1944, she was rejected, and her application was rejected because she was Black, because of an adherence to segregation. And so that's how she ends up at Western Virginia State College. But then this speaks to her character. She's rejected from the university. Eventually, she finds her way back to Wyoming, and she earns an MA in education from the University of Wyoming. We think of her as a politician, but she was quite the advocate for teachers, particularly K through 12 teachers, making sure that they had higher pay, all the access to educational materials that the teachers need in order to make a classroom successful. Those are still social justice issues that in education that we're talking about around the country, but she's part of those early conversations. But for example, when you say that because of segregation, she was not hired into Laramie County School District 1, that is Cheyenne, because of segregation. So she was compelled to teach on the Air Force Base. But what's missing a bit from that was she was primarily in charge of teaching African American children. I would not have known that had I not had that conversation with her about how segregation also impacted at times military bases. And so she lived through that history. And the funny thing was, I don't know if you knew this, her paycheck in 1959 teaching at Goings Elementary School in Cheyenne was $4,400 a year.
Is that just like teachers' wages in general, or is it because of her race and her status in
I dug
society?
into that and I just couldn't find anything that said per se that that was her pay as a Black woman versus the pay of the average educator. So
I mean, either way, it's unimaginable to
either
consider that
way,
being a living wage. That's
either
wild.
way, it's a stretch. But she's most known for being obviously the senator. But even in the time, she surprised me by, I always equate her with the passage of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And she talked to me about a seatbelt law. And she talked to me about, fighting for adequate handicap parking in the state. This shows you that as a politician, she had a very integrated systems approach where she wasn't going to be essentialized as I'm only going to fight for the Black people in Wyoming, but rather she said, I'm going to represent everyone in my state, regardless of political affiliation, and I'm going to fight for causes that affect all of us. And all of us are affected by seatbelt laws. Many of us, excuse me, are affected by handicap parking, and all of us are impacted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And so I really like that non-essentialist approach that she took to social justice issues, because that's how you bring everyone into the fold, not
Right,
just certain
right.
people left behind.
Yeah. And I think that point is highlighted. I mean, Wyoming is already overwhelmingly Republican, but I mean, during, her time serving, it was even more so, if that's imaginable. So not only was she, a Black woman in this seat, but she was, on the other side of the party line, and you just had a lot against her in terms of getting anything done. And so her successes in the House and the Senate, I mean, um, unimaginable if like put up against her trials today. But in saying that, I mean, we talk about this rich history, and I mean, for how long she served in the legislature. I mean, she was somewhat popular, right? Like she wasn't just like a one and done electorate who got in on a fluke. And so I'm curious, what is your assumption or idea about how her legacy got, sort of only passed by or passed around through these oral histories? What's your idea of why there is not more written and concreted, or even statues erected or schools named after her or things of that matter?
I think that happens to many women who are leaders and women who are in politics. And in terms of who makes it to the history books, it's by and large men over women. I mean, I have a colleague, Dr. Nancy Small, and she's working on Swain and suffrage kinds of moments that are often erased, where Wyoming can claim many firsts. And so I would say if history books have overlooked her, then that is their error in not doing due diligence into the rich history of the state of Wyoming. Because of nothing else, why Mrs. Byrd was successful was not only because she was bright, she was also personable, but she did the old school thing and went door to door and had conversations with people. And that's why I say the art of dialogue is so important. I think it's something that we're missing even in politics today, because we're in such political silos. We also have social media. She didn't have to contend with social media in the way that we do today. But in thinking about Wyoming, which is a state of a little over 500,000 people, it's important for you to go and have those dialogues, because the person in office could be your neighbor. And so it's important to say, I'm approachable, I am a person. I would say, and there's a really nice video that was done of Mrs. Byrd that PBS Wyoming did of her. And after I watched that video, the first word I thought about was tenacious. She was simply tenacious, where she just did not give up. If someone told her no, and let's just say she was a staunch Democrat, so let's say it was someone who was on the Republican side, And instead of saying, well, they said no, and I'm taking my ball and going home kind of attitude, she said, well, let me walk down the hallway and talk to so and ask what might be the issue. How might I be able to get whatever bill I'm sponsoring through, or get people to say yes to the vote, whatever she was proposing. The best example I can think of her tenaciousness was with the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday. She tried 9 times to get that passed. And she could, every time it was, why, what is happening? She had some conversations with the then governor. She spoke to her other colleagues, one of whom, I can't remember his name, but said, well, I don't think there should be a holiday named after somebody who didn't come to the state of Wyoming. So I asked her, and this is one of the little things that's missing from the official histories at times. And so I said, well, how did you get it passed? And she said, after speaking with a bunch of her colleagues, she also spoke with the governor at the time, just seeking feedback. Like, how can I make this be more of an appeal to Wyoming citizens? And she was given the advice and took the advice of adding Equality Day in front of that. So I have been very strategic in my language, where I refer to it as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. But actually, officially in Wyoming, it is the Equality Day / MLK Day. And so when I was talking with her about how that felt, she said she felt joy about getting this passed, but also questioning, does there need to be another Equality Day, since there's National Equality Day on August 26th.
Right.
There's Suffrage Day, which we all just celebrated in 2019 for the 100th anniversary. And then now we have another Equality Day. Yeah, so it was just really interesting to hear the behind the scenes political, wranglings that happen that we lay people often don't get. But I don't know if I would have tried 9 times. And so that just goes to show you, she just did not give up, because she knew that that was an important day for the state of Wyoming to also be included in.
Right. And yeah, that persistence, the 9 times attempts, the attempting to go to Wyoming for bachelor's, leaving, coming back, going again. I mean, it was, it almost feels like something was pulling, she was meant to be, sort of like what we're offhand talking about before, her place found her, and she beat all odds. But you mentioned, she campaigned and she went door to door, and she had to talk to these colleagues of her that, if they didn't necessarily disagree with her political stance, they could have disagreed with her being and her rights. And so did she ever indulge you in sort of, how communication, like how she got through it? How did she, figure out the sweet spot of how to communicate with people that, maybe didn't agree with her?
Right. Well, I know she said she went back twice. So imagine going door to door once and then you go back
Right.
through it again. I mean, that's why I say she was tenacious, she was smart, she was patient. But I think that there's something missing in politics today that didn't exist in her time. And I keep going back to that, crossing the aisle, going and having that conversation. And maybe it's more unique in the state of Wyoming. I have no proof of that, but I'll offer this example. So when I first moved to Wyoming to come and teach at the University of Wyoming, I was invited to a party. And I went to this party, and there was a guy who was sitting by himself. And I said, well, I don't know anyone. He's not talking to anyone, and I'm not talking to anyone. So I walked up to him and I said, hi, I'm Tracey Patton. And he said, hi, I'm Dave. And I said, well, hi, Dave. What do you do? And he said, like looking around, kind of, is this a joke? And he said, I'm the governor. And, and I had no idea that at just some random party, I would meet Governor Dave Freudenthal. And so that's what I mean by Wyoming has to be a state, and particularly in politics, where she was a staunch Democrat, working with a mostly Republican legislature, she had to cross the aisle to have those dialogues. You can't just dig your heels in and say, I'm not speaking to anyone else. And so that's why I appreciate about by her when Governor Dave was the governor, as a rhetorician, I liked that fact that we had people who had who wore different political caps working with one another rather than not working together at all. So I think that she had no choice. If she wanted to serve the state that she loved, and she did it well, she knew she'd have to have conversations with people, even if they disagreed with her. So then comes in that act of persuasion. What can we agree upon? And then how do you go forward from that platform rather than saying we're so different we can't even talk to one another?
Right, right. The willingness to compromise, I think, is another big. It plays into your part of like crossing the aisle and being open minded enough to be like, well, maybe we can satisfy each other at least partially, but we have to have a conversation first to do that. Also, I think
Right.
it's incredible that you got invited to a party with the governor.
Yeah,
Like, what a social group.
that was just by happenstance with someone who knew I was new on campus saying she needs to make a friend. Like let's go and have her get to know the community and other people. But I will say what I'm talking about right now are simply the basics of public speaking. This is what we teach in communication and teach our public speaking students is the basic art of persuasion. And sometimes part of that persuasion is simply having a face-to-face conversation. Or I had some students one time and they were doing some group work and the group wasn't working well together. And, and I said, you know what you all need? Buy some pizza and have a conversation. And so I think by her going door to door, as well as employing the art of listening well, and I'm being very strategic about that. I think we often think that we're good listeners, but research shows that we're actually poor listeners because we're too busy thinking about what our response might be if someone says X instead of Y. And so, really doing that critical, rhetorical listening, that mirroring, that echoing, that feedback back, the nonverbals, making sure that the person who you're engaged with, actually you're hearing them and you're letting them know that you hear them. And I think that she was very skilled at doing that, obviously, since she served
Yeah.
the state of Wyoming for a total of 12 years.
Right, right. And I'm sure you got that same impression from having direct conversations with her, right? I'm sure she didn't lose that spark of great public speaking and persuasion.
Not at all. She's engaging, she's dynamic, she's a storyteller. And and maybe that's what good politicians do, is that they're able to also tell a story. But I met with her multiple times. Her family was nice enough to include me at dinners and things. And I just felt very welcomed by her. She just has an open spirit where you just wanted to just learn from her and learn her perspective, because I am not a native Wyomingite. And so to learn what Wyoming looked like before statehood, so her sharing the stories of her father, to how it looked for her serving the state of Wyoming and what it looks like for her children, some of
Right.
whom served also the state of Wyoming, like James Byrd.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, her family is just there's something in the gene pool that just makes absolutely incredible leaders and passionate people, and that's why it's so wild to me. Like you said, they're almost that 10 generation of Wyomingites at this point, close to 8 or so. And that's why it's, I just can't wrap my head around just how buried this legacy. I mean, not only of her father, of her son. I mean, and her son is still alive, thankfully. But I mean, the impact that they've made and the roles that they've held that aren't usually held by people that look like us in Wyoming. And so how does injecting this accurate legacy of Liz Byrd align with widening the accepted history of Wyoming, and where does she play a role, or maybe a better question is how should her legacy be injected into the history of Wyoming in order to expand that mainstream narrative?
I think her history should be told side by side with any other history about the state of Wyoming. simply because she served the state. And she did incredible things. I mean, I'll touch back on the question again, but she brings Black women into visibility and focus. You can't, there's not one state in this country, there's not any place on the planet, and this includes Antarctica, since I asked former student of mine who worked in Antarctica, where there haven't been Black people in on every planet, on every continent. And so where there are people, there are also Black people. Where there are people, there are also Black people making history, because she is part of American history. And she is a very significant part of women's history. The issue, whenever we narrow our focus of who is included and excluded within American history, we miss people. We miss some of the most important moments and some of the most important history. And in this case, with the state of Wyoming, what people are missing is Black women, since we're focused on Mrs. Byrd at this moment, is Black women in the state. Black women have been largely absent to non-existent, and we simply know that that is not true. And so by having a better, more in-depth accounting of Mrs. Byrd, we also then learn more about ourselves and about what we know about the state of Wyoming.
Right,
and so
right.
that's what makes her so important, because if we didn't have her story and history, we would have an absence. And absences and silences are very difficult to fill. And so then you fill them with what I like to call post memory, like these imaginings of, if there were people here, what would have happened? If then that. Well, we know that there was a diverse body of BIPOC people here, and Mrs. Byrd and her family are also part of that legacy and the retelling of what is now known as the state of Wyoming.
Right, right. And you bring up a good point. What was that term again that you say with the imagining the history and recreating it?
Yeah, I call it post memory. So memory is that official recorded accounting of something. Like we know the official beginning, middle, and end of an event. And I like to use the term post memory, because it's not that it's after, it's what is in addition to. Who was left off of the table? How do we bring them back into visibility? What do they have to tell us, to teach us, to expand our knowledge, learning, and understanding?
Right, right. So in 2021, as we sit now, and being what seems like so far away, but really not, about 100 years, but what role, if it's the sole role or if it just plays a minor part, does oral history play in filling these gaps that we see? Or is it more, are we at the stage now where post memory is sort of all we can rely on? What's your take on, how does this hole get filled today by people like you and remaining family members?
Well, I think that it's sharing the story, having events like this, but it's also the way in which history is recorded and how scholars record it in the textbooks that we teach our K through 12, and then how we teach history from university on forward. And so it's important to have some of those moments of, who George Washington was and things like that. But I also like, with oral history, we're able to bring other people in and complicate the narrative. And that's what post memory does. And that's what oral history does, when you're able to speak with the actual person and or family members and descendants. We're able to make the person more complex than they actually were, thereby making that history in time more complex. And by having that complexity, we grow as everyday average people who have a better understanding of not only our history in Wyoming, but our history as a nation, and then our history internationally as well. I mean, Mrs. Byrd understood this because one of the things that she did, and you had so much to include, I don't think I heard this part, but she was part of the, and I'm reading it so I get it correctly. She served on the British Marshall Scholarship Commission for the Pacific region, which awarded US students scholarships to attend university in Great Britain. That means that as a politician, she saw the importance of understanding our nation through an intercultural or a cross-cultural lens. And one of the best ways to create citizens, not only of the state of Wyoming, but of the nation, is to create citizens for the world, to provide lovely educational opportunities for rural students as well as students in cities. And so I find that very important in terms of who she was, because she knows that even with what we learn in our average US history class, that there's nothing like learning a new perspective from going abroad. You go abroad, you understand your country even better. And that's what she was giving to Wyoming citizens as well as citizens of the United States, that opportunity to apply cross-cultural knowledge. You have to learn to hear the stories of the actual people, because that just makes it so you can understand who you are better and who you are as a world citizen. By talking to Mrs. Byrd, before I was brand new to Wyoming, after speaking with it and wondering, I have a great job, I have great students. How does one fit in the state when I don't have a long legacy that people are very proud of, and rightly so? So Mrs. Byrd allowed me to find my moment into why I'm here in Wyoming and why it's important. And she talked about the importance of representation of self for people who look like you, but also representation for diverse thoughts and thinking. So people who might not think exactly the same way you do at the table. And so having that diversity of thought, that engagement, that interaction.
Right, right. So this, I mean, it seems like the prime time, or overdue, but with the resources we have and the time we are, this is seems like the prime time to start filling in those gaps, right, and collecting these histories that as people pass, it passes, it goes with them. And so I'm going to go ahead and go to the chat and see questions we have from our attendees. This is from Dr. Flemings. Dr. Patton, after meeting with Mrs. Byrd, what do you think was your biggest takeaway?
So I said the word tenacious came about, so sometimes you think to yourself, she tried 9 times for one bill. Like, I can make it, I can get through. Like, I could get through Wednesday, like whatever Wednesday might look for somebody. My biggest takeaway from her is patriot in all its complexities, absences, all of the racism that she faced, and she recounted some of it in this PBS show, as well as some one-on-one conversations. She didn't let other people's defining her or other people's narrow-mindedness or racism define who she was and how she saw herself. And because she carried herself so proudly and strong, and she was an educator, when we being African American Diaspora Studies in, I think it was around January 2016-ish, maybe the spring of spring of 2016, we had an event for her where, announcing this fund being established, and we invited loads of her former students, and we also invited her colleagues, her mostly Republican colleagues, and they showed up. They gave wonderful statements. They presented her with the US flag, how it's, folded in that special way. And so to me, that says that she met people where they were. She had conversations. She saw humanity in people. And so that was my takeaway from her, was she met me where I was to educate me about Black history in Wyoming. And I think that's a very special trait that very few people have. Usually, a politician of her caliber, she could have spoken down to anyone, but she chose people to meet them where they were. And I think that's my biggest takeaway and learning lesson from her is regardless of pedigree that one has, regardless of how many letters one may have after their name, that everyone has an important experience and story to share. And she was willing to listen, and that made me become a better listener as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's incredible. The word that comes to your mind is patriot, especially recently, sort of seeing that word overtaken with um, um, severe political ideologies that maybe don't align. But I mean, when you think about it, I think that the true definition of what a patriot is and what it should be, I mean, she embodies it, right? And we not only see her excluded from just the mainstream narrative, but I mean, I can't, without meeting her, I don't know if patriot would have been the word I would have thought of, but it makes so much sense when you look at her legacy, look at what she did, and look at her love and passion for her community, whether they shared it with her or not. And so I think that's a beautiful way to reclaim that word of patriot, right? Because I don't think it should be overshadowed by people that don't embody what Mrs. Byrd embodied, right? Which was community care, intersectionality, and passion, for everything she did.
Absolutely, because if I were her, I would have said bye to the state.
Right.
The she'd been here for multiple generations. Her family was here before when it was a territory. She ends up being rejected at one point by the University of Wyoming, but then she chooses to come back here. I would have looked at all of those signs in the universe and said, I am supposed to be someplace else.
Right.
And
Right.
she looked at it and said, challenge accepted. And I would add that she was seen throughout the region, even if sometimes she doesn't make it into all of the history books, since she did receive a Distinguished Citizen Award and Special Recognition Award by the Colorado Black Women of Political Action. So she was seen at least regionally. And now is the time to add her into some of those national voices because she was so
Right.
impactful in that way.
Right, right. And that's I watched something earlier this week about how when she was picking a grad school or a bachelor's program to go into, she thought about going down to, I think it was Boulder.
No,
And
it
then
was UNC, University of Northern Colorado,
okay,
also rejected her for
yeah,
segregation.
same. So I mean, it's just wild, and I think it shows, not only the impact that she had on Wyoming, but I mean the whole West, right? Sort of being a frontier of not necessarily the land, but the institutions that weren't used to or ready or willing to accept people that look like her. And so it's just, the span of her impact, right, of going across borders, is just incredible. There's another question here. Dr. Patton, do you have a favorite personal story of your time visiting with Mrs. Byrd, or a favorite story of hers that she shared with you that you haven't told us about yet?
A favorite story. So I really liked how she told me the interworkings of getting the MLK Day passed. It allowed me to see that politics is politics wherever you are in any state. So
Right.
I like that. I would say one of the stories that I really cherished, and it was one of the last times I ever saw her alive, was I went out to dinner with her and her family, and it was at a big long table, so it was more than just me there. But I was lucky enough to sit next to her, and we were just eating and talking and whatnot, just regular chit chat. And out of nowhere, she started sharing these lovely personal stories of how she met her husband. And that was it. Her husband, even in his own right, he was the first police captain, I believe,
Yeah, in Cheyenne, I think police
in
chief.
Cheyenne. And, it was really nice that she trusted me enough after all these years didn't look at me as, I just want to name a scholarship after you and then go on in life. It really meant, it was very touching to see how even after her husband had passed and she had been widowed, how much love she had for him and how much pride. And that conversation I won't recount in detail, but I really felt special by that. And whenever I think about her, I remember that first. And then I remember all of her political successes second, because it always reminds me that we are more than our titles. One day we will all retire if we're lucky enough. And it's who you are as a human being that ultimately makes the difference. And she saw something of what could be the possibility of in the, of the state of Wyoming. And so I take away visionary would also be the other word, but that's my little special story. Is I loved hearing about the political who's who of what happened. And then I also really liked that personal touch that she offered.
Right, right. And what an honor to have, at that point, such an intimate relationship where you really, I mean, at least from my perspective, you really got to know her, right? And not her work or her as a senator or legislator. It was, you got to really know the Elizabeth Byrd, and I mean, what an incredible experience. I can't imagine, all that you've taken away from that you can't necessarily put into words, but that has impacted your work and your research and your teaching.
Absolutely. As a communication scholar, I know oral histories are important. I write on oral histories, but I didn't up until that point in time. And after the years that I got to know her, it it allowed me to see how important that really is. But I will say, like any person, she shared the stories that she felt safe in sharing. And that's what is also important about oral histories, is that if you talk to someone, they're not going to tell you their whole life story and disclose every single thing about them. Sometimes people don't tell you the whole story, or they want to save face. And so they'll tell you what they think you want to hear.
Right.
And with Mrs. Byrd, she was not that person. She told me to use Cicero's term, she was very plain speaking. She told me exactly like who's who, what's what, and the progress, so that I have a clear understanding of what was happening. So I think with Mrs. Byrd, what makes her so popular today, particularly amongst her students, when we had that event in 2016, I mean, I was planning on, maybe 50 people will show up. I think we had something like 200 something, and the majority of them were her former students. So she started out as an educator, and I think that she applied those same skills that we in the education field learn and apply them to the state of Wyoming, because education is all about growth, your understanding and growth as a human being. And I think that's what she did with the state of Wyoming.
Right, right. And you sort of touched on this, but can you bring clarity to, how did Mrs. Byrd bring clarity to your position as an educator at UW after meeting her and having these continuous conversations?
How she affected me as an educator, or
Yep.
I
Or
would
brought clarity to your position. That's the word.
Well, education has always been my passion. My mother told me when I was like 4 years old, my go-to was writing on the chalkboard and pretending that I was teaching class. I would say that speaking with Mrs. Byrd gave me a better understanding of my students who are from Wyoming. Since I earned all of my academic degrees at UW rival schools, that was not the intent, so no one hold that against me. But I think that she allowed me to have a better understanding of where some of the students are coming from. I grew up in big cities. I spent half of my life in Europe, and specifically Germany, mostly. But, since I said this was the smallest place I've ever lived, for some people in the state of Wyoming, coming to a Laramie is like coming to a metropolis. Some students may grow up in a town of 50 people. And so since she had that multi-generation legacy behind her of what it means to be a Wyomingite. That was very helpful for me in understanding my students and where they might be coming from and approaching education and what their goals are. So that was a wonderful takeaway for me in terms of how to better understand my students.
Right, right. And no better a source of someone that doesn't, sugarcoat or tell you what you wanted to hear, right? Like that's
Oh
sometimes
no.
that lesson of learning how students are in a new place is difficult. And so I mean, I can't imagine a better person to offer that insight to you. That sounds like an incredible experience.
Well, I think that's the
Um,
role of an elder, and the elders are supposed to, we stand on their shoulders. So I stand on her shoulders. Were it not for Mrs. Byrd, there might not be a me, in the state of Wyoming. And so I stand on her shoulders, but also elders sometimes tell us what we don't want to hear because it's not all about making us feel bubble wrapped and safe, but they also want us to succeed. And I think that, she always knew what the state of Wyoming could be. And so I think that she had these goals in her head as well of what the state could be and how the state of equality can be more inclusive to more of its residents.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. We are coming up right on the hour mark. If it's okay with you, Dr. Patton, I want to be respectful of your time. I know it flies by. This
It
has been
really
incredible.
does.
I have one and a half more questions. I think we can sort of put them together, half from the chat and half from one I wanted to talk about. What do you think from the chat? What do you think Mrs. Byrd would think about the current state of MLK DOD? And coupled with that, I want to follow up and you can go in whatever order you want. I want to hear about your role and your experience in overseeing getting the Liz Byrd Excellence Fund together.
Oh, okay. So the role of DOD, well, in my time meeting with her, she never said anything negative about it. So I think that she would have, or if she had any concerns about the university, she would have let me know. I think
Do you know
that
if
she
she's
was,
ever invited to speak? I'm sorry for interrupting.
oh, I'm sorry. Did they ever invite her to speak?
Mm-hmm.
If they did, that would have predated me at the university. I know she has spoken in the College of Education, and that's where she earned her master's degree from.
Right.
And so I know that she's been invited into various departments and colleges and classrooms in that way. I don't know enough of the history of DoD to remember every single speaker because a lot of that predates me. I probably know maybe the last 5 years of speakers, but I would say that the goal of DoD is to to celebrate Dr. King's life and achievements. And even if he didn't come into the state of Wyoming, how the state of Wyoming benefits. And so that was a large part of Mrs. Byrd's argument whenever she was proposing for the 9 times a Dr. King Day to happen. So I would say that DOD could be doing their job according to her, just because it's about education. And it's
Right.
about education that happens in terms of Black history in Wyoming during that 1 week period of time for not only the university and not only for the city of Laramie, but also for the greater state of Wyoming. So I
Right.
think that
Right.
I don't want to put any words in her mouth, but since she never criticized it, I would think that she would think that that is an excellent goal, because she would have looked at it through the eyes of an educator, of educating the state in any way,
Right.
shape, or form. And you have to start somewhere. And I think that's a great place to start is DOD, because it's diverse programming that happens with that. And
Right.
what was the second part? Oh, how I
Um,
came to creating the fund. So it took many, many, many years, but it was also very important. She knew the importance, and I wanted to make sure, and this is real talk here, because more people started at that period of time. For some reason, she like hit the radar. And so I honestly wanted to make sure that our Black Studies department got an excellence fund in her name before any other place on campus, because then we would never be able to have her be part of us. us in the Black Studies division. Like, you know, once you name someone, it can't be renamed. You know, there's this whole thing about it. So I'm sure she was approached by probably other people, but I was lucky enough that she saw value in the pedagogical excellence that African American Diaspora Studies was aiming for. And she and the family agreed that it would be important to, you know, have her name attached to such an important legacy. And I think by having her name there, we also give an example of a Wyomingite who is a person of color, a Black American who has done great things for the state of Wyoming.
Right. So a passion that had been burning for a while, maybe that just right place, right time for both of you in terms of letting her be honored in one of the many ways she deserves, and allowing you to sort of get this intimate and personal relationship with her that ultimately impacted your being in Wyoming and your education style today. So, I mean, it seems like it couldn't have come together more perfect.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully she said yes. She could have told me all these wonderful stories and said, "Oh, that's sweet." No.
Right, right.
Been ever thankful to the family for being so kind, being so inclusive. You know, I would like to say, because since we're ending, my little summary statement of how I think about Mrs. Byrd. It was one of her students. I don't remember the person's name. They came to our event, our 2016 event, and this stayed with me. The true significance of Mrs. Byrd's life is not so much in enduring small thinking as much as in loving all people and succeeding in spite of small thinking. And she was very much someone who said, "You're oppressed, you're marginalized, you're receiving racism. Okay, what are you going to do about it?" She did not let you sit and wallow in that. She said, "What are you going to do about it?" And so that's why I say tenacious.
Yeah, and ultimately that's probably what led her to surviving and thriving in Wyoming for so long, right? Just doing her thing, letting the thorns stick her wherever they may, but not letting that ever stopping her forward progress. So, I mean, what an amazing woman! What an amazing legacy! It's absolutely incredible to hear your personal testimonies that you have from spending time with her. I mean, it's been an honor listening and hearing everything you've had to offer and learning about Mrs. Byrd. And so I just thank you, Dr. Patton, for everything you've offered today and in the past. Obviously, this Excellence Fund and creating this wonderful relationship and moving to Wyoming and being sort of, being you in Wyoming. I mean, it just takes so much strength and it really, I don't know if it could be done without the support systems, right? And standing on the shoulders of those that came before us and building off of what they had started before they stopped. And so I thank you so much, Dr. Patton, for joining us tonight. This was absolutely fantastic. And thank you, everyone, all of the attendees and everyone that submitted questions and everything. This was an incredible fireside chat. And I don't know if Dr. Dixon is coming back on, but if you have any more closing remarks, Dr. Patton, feel free.
I don't, other than thank you so much for letting me talk about an amazing woman who in some ways took me under her arm to give me different advice and ways of seeing and succeeding here in Wyoming. So, and a big shout out to her wonderful family who was oh so nice, and they're friendly, just wonderful people who are great ambassadors for the state of Wyoming. I'll tell you that.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And this is the first of many steps to concrete this history, right? And to transfer these oral histories into something that can maybe be more easily or comprehensively passed down to those that come after us in Wyoming and come and don't know anything about Liz Byrd, right? And such an influential figure in our state and for the whole nation. And so I really do think this is a
shout out to the AHC, the American History Center.
American Heritage Center?
American Heritage Center. Thank you. I knew I had history.
Yeah.
American Heritage Center. Sorry, AHC, but they are they have a wealth of information as well on Mrs. Byrd, as well as a special box So you could go look at special materials if you would like to learn more on Mrs. Byrd. They have a wonderful archive there.
Oh, that's awesome to know. And I know for sure this is definitely not the last time the Black Studies Center will be hosting something about Mrs. Byrd, or at least providing access to resources that are so impactful and important regarding Mrs. Byrd's legacy. So lots to come in the future from all sorts of people. And I'm just really glad that we got to have this conversation. And if the wheel wasn't turning before, hopefully this was a little bit of a catalyst for it, if not. But thank you again, Dr. Patton. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Toby and Dr. Dixon, for all you do for setting everything up. And I don't know if I have any announcements to share. I don't think so, but please keep up with our social media pages and the African American and Diaspora Studies website, so the Black Studies Center website, to get information about our next webinar, or if it will be in person. I don't know. The state of COVID is really strange right now. I personally like the webinar just because you can record it, watch it later, and share it with the world. But there's definitely that intimate, personal thing that I miss about in-person presentations and talks. So who knows where we will be, but we will be around. We will be doing more of this. We will be contributing to the mainstream narrative, making it complex. As you said, I really like that perspective of complicating what people know, right? Not in a negative sense, but in a necessary sense, and filling those gaps. So
well,
thank you everyone
so
for
much,
joining
Kimberly.
us tonight. Of course, Dr. Patton. It was great to see you. It's great to talk to you for so long. Hopefully one day we will see each other in person before I leave. But
we will.
Oh,
Social
yeah, no
distancing
doubt.
outside. There'll be warm days
Oh
in
yeah.
Wyoming in June.
Oh, if we're lucky, if we're lucky.